Hello, beer nerds. We are hopefully on our last video of the series, and I apologize because it might be a little bit noisy in the background, but we are going to be going over, for all intents and purposes, what we consider adjunct malts, or more so adjunct grain.
We say adjunct malts because we actually will be lumping in the malt versions of things like wheat, malted rye, malted triticale, malted spelt, because we use them kind of in the same way. And most of these adjuncts we're using to build body, although some of them actually serve to dry out beer.
Exactly. So let's just go right into it. We're going to break these guys down by type of grain. And I think our first one we're going to talk about is wheat, because it's going to be probably the most common. You can use wheat malt in almost every style of wheat beer.
That's probably a good idea.
Oh, yeah. Anyway.
Wheat malt specifically, you can use up to 100% of the grain bill, although most commonly you'll be seeing it used anywhere between that 40% and 60% of your grain bill for all of your wit beers, wheats, gozes, all those things.
And it does have diastatic power like we've talked about before, so it will convert itself.
On the smaller end of the spectrum, if you're using it just for a little bit of body, I like it in that 15% range. Serves a great kind of builder to things like IPAs, or even a little bit more if you're using it in like a pale ale to kind of give that extra pop.
Next, let's talk about flaked wheat. So flaked wheat is unmalted, right?
It's also pre-gelatinized, meaning that all the good sugars and starches in there are easier to dissolve into your beer.
This is going to give you a little bit better body, a little higher protein content compared to wheat malt. Also, it's going to really stick your mash up, right?
It definitely will. So doing something like a beta-glucanase rest, for example, can be really helpful if you're using a lot of this in your mash. Also using rice hulls.
That'll help too. Flaked wheat is probably going to be used in a little bit less percentage compared to wheat malt, typically in that maybe 10 to 20% range of a grain bill, depending on what you're brewing.
Yeah, and it offers the same puffiness that you get from malted wheat, but just at a much higher degree.
Much higher degree.
Let's talk about, next we'll go into torrefied wheat. Torrefied wheat is also unmalted, but it goes through a puffing process, but basically pseudo-toasts it, so you get some nice additional character off of that.
Yeah, it's going to be really hard to mill for one thing, but the flavor profile I like to describe in torrefied wheat is that it's almost popcorny.
Like Golden Grams, is that the one?
No, not a sweet, just like a nice dry popcorn characteristic.
I'm trying to think of the cereal. What's the one with the frog on it? That, but without the sweetness.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, what do we have? We actually have a few other different types of wheat. We also have a red wheat, which is going to have a little bit higher protein content compared to white wheat. And then we also have, dark wheat as well, right?
Dark wheat is basically the Vienna of the wheat malt world. So those are also both malted, but we use them kind of in that same adjunct realm.
Oh yeah, we also have unmalted wheat as well, which is just kind of like it sounds.
Yeah, so unmalted wheat, you get all the same body building proteins and dextrins and everything like that you get from, let's say, the flaked. But since it's not gelatinized, it's actually a lot harder to get all that out. Unmalted wheat might stand up a little bit better in something like a proper step mash because you're taking the time to go through all those steps and reap out all the proteins and starches from that.
Before we move on, let's briefly hit on flaked barley, which is one that is used in certain beers but isn't quite as common.
So although this is barley, it's not malted, so it still counts as an adjunct. Score! It's most commonly used in Irish stouts, and basically what it does is it gives you a kind of a grainy feel, but still a little bit of that same puffiness that you get from every other flaked grain.
Generally, flaked barley and flaked oats can go pretty much hand in hand.
Except for oats taste better.
Speaking of oats, let's go on to our next grain.
There's a bunch of different types of oats, starting with oat malt like we did with the wheat, I suppose.
Oat malt is a fantastic substitute for any kind of flaked oats in your hazies because it still maintains the husk. That's probably my favorite use for it is in a hazy. You have all those bodybuilding characteristics like we talked about in wheat, but it maintains the husk so you don't end up with stuck mashes.
And unlike wheat, which we use in like West Coast styles to build that body and puffiness, oats will be slick instead of puffy. So that slickness actually plays really well into all the hop oils in something like a hazy as well.
I think that covers it for malted oats. Let's now talk about its unmalted and also flaked cousin. I wonder what that could be.
It's going to be flaked oats, right?
Whoa.
Nailed it. Flaked oats you can use in two different ways. The first is to pre-cook or throw it in a sheet pan and actually get some caramelization, some Maillard reaction on that to get it toasted, which you'll see oftentimes used in something like an oatmeal stout. Or you can use it raw, which goes really well in something like a oatmeal pale ale or just to build body in pretty much any other style of beer. Oat flakes, you should be using up to 20% on the really high end, but you can get a lot of body in extraness off of just 10%.
This is what you'll typically see in hazies and or your breakfast.
So these flaked oats, they can be substituted for rolled oats, gelatinized oats, quick oats, pretty much anything that you find in those Quaker cans in the store. It all pretty much works the same. So moving on from the flaked oats and all the other thereabouts that go along with that, we have a sort of proprietary product called Golden Naked Oats.
These are probably the tastiest thing that I have had in the last 5 minutes, mostly because I've been munching on them.
They kind of taste like sunflower seeds mixed with a no-bake cookie.
They're really taste like sunflower seeds. But they got some nuttiness to them as well.
That's one that we have yet to use in a beer, but we've heard a lot of good things and are excited to use them. We would probably substitute those in anywhere where we would use oat malt. So moving on, let's talk about some rye. Let's start with rye malt because that seems to be the pattern we've been taking. Rye malt kind of works in the same way as wheat malt, except for its yield is usually a little bit less and it's got an extra spicy component to it.
Rye is going to be, honestly, what I can see the most pungent of flavors of all the adjunct grains that we are going to be talking about today.
With the exception of purple Egyptian barley.
With the exception of purple Egyptian barley, apparently, because I forgot we had that. But yes, like Peter said, it's going to be spicy. It's going to have quite a bit of flavor. Typically, you won't use this in more than maybe 30% max in any grain bill that you're using.
And if you go over that, you really need to think about doing something like a step mash or a decoction mash.
Because the other issue that rye has is it will stick your mash up like nothing else. So that's rye malt for you. Use some rice hulls. Yeah.
Moving on from rye malt, let's go with flaked rye. The biggest difference between rye malt and flaked rye I've noticed is that flaked rye really takes that pumpernickel-esque spiciness that you get off of rye and turns it up to the maximum. So you can use 10 to 15% flaked rye and get a really aggressive quality of that. Whereas, even using 20 to 30% of the rye malt, it might not be quite as assertive. It's still going to be there because rye is very pungent.
Perfect. Well, I think that covers rye. I would say one last thing is to make sure that you're using rice hulls in just about every brew that you do if you're going to use high amounts of rye. Otherwise, let's talk about flaked corn next. How's that sound?
Love me some flaked corn. Flaked corn serves to dry out beer. So unlike everything else we've talked about where it's going to add body to it, flaked corn will do the opposite. It's giving you a lot of fermentable sugars without a lot of other stuff.
Flaked corn gives this really nice mellow flavor and what I like to call just a really light, biscuity warmth that you get from the flavor of flaked corn. But also, like Peter mentioned, it actually converts quite a bit. So you can actually use this in pretty high amounts, even up to maybe 30%, and just get a nice kind of warm-bodied beer as a result of it.
It's also very low in color,
which actually kind of has an impact on a lot of really light, low ABV beers, right?
Mm-hmm. So flaked corn, basically, we'll be using it in light lagers, American style, cream ales, and Kentucky Commons.
That's flaked corn for you. Should we go on to flake rice? Let's talk about rice.
While flaked corn serves to add a little bit of kind of meatiness, a little bit of extraness, which on a very light beer can add something, some assertiveness to the actual flavor of the beer without necessarily adding extra body or sweetness. Flaked rice kind of does the opposite sometimes. It still dries out the beer, but it gives you a smooth creaminess instead of that bold assertiveness.
It does. I think flaked rice is probably one of the mellowest of all the adjuncts that we have. If you ever want to just really tone down a beer, flaked rice is the way to go. As for percentages, what I would use, probably you really don't want much of it in there, honestly. You can use higher percentages, but I usually like to stick around 10 to 15% and allow the other malts in there to actually come through a little bit.
More often than not, what I'll do is I'll actually use it in conjunction with flaked corn. So I'll use let's say I use 10% flaked corn and 5% flaked rice. And it really just serves to round out that body and give you a smoothie creaminess. So that pretty much wraps up everything that we'll see in normal grain bills, normal recipes. Just a quick one-off, some of these do come in roasted forms, but that would really get lumped into our roasted malt video, which is iCarded somewhere. Let's talk about some lesser-known stuff, and we'll just kind of rattle them off really quick. Triticale is probably one of my favorite lesser-known grains that you can use, and it is basically a hybrid between wheat and rye.
Yeah, I like to use triticale when I want to get some of that rye character, but don't want it up in my face. It's kind of like rye toned down about 3 notches.
Plus, the triticale that we have in stock right now is super extra husky, which makes it good for filtering out the mash bed.
That is very true.
Spelt is another grain.
Spelt is actually something that we made a fantastic saison with, and I think that really added to the character of the beer. Nice light beer, but still had lots of body, lots of sort of delicate malt complexity.
Yeah, spelt is, I believe, ancient wheat. And some people think it's gluten-free. It's not, but it is less gluten than you would get off of a normal wheat, rye, all that jazz.
Which probably helped for clarity. So if you want to kind of have like a nice wheat substitute that's going to still hopefully make for a clear beer, spelt might be a good option.
Might be a fun thing to play around with. So thanks to our awesome local maltster called Link Malts. I don't think we've mentioned them yet in this series.
No.
We have access to a lot of heritage varietals as well as some unique grains that we would not otherwise get. One of those is purple Egyptian barley malt.
This one is particularly unique because it actually, for one, gives a purple color to the beer, but also sort of gives it this really, really light, I kind of contribute it to like a stone fruit type fruitiness that you really don't get from any other malt.
It is important to say that this malt is not very enzymatic, meaning it's going to be very difficult for it to self-convert. I've seen it used up to maybe 50%, but most commonly is used less than 20% because it is so high in proteins that it will gum up your mash. It's going to be hard to mash with, and then also it does need the enzymes from other grains to help it out.
Definitely. I tried to use it 100% once. Didn't work out so well.
We'll give it another shot, but you definitely need a step mash or a decoction mash to fully make it work.
I do think the flavor of this, though, is plenty to hold up. 20, 30%, plenty to use. So there are plenty of other adjunct grains out there, things like millet, things like sorghum, right, that we don't really carry here. However, I think that covers a pretty wide basis.
Long grain wild rice could work, I guess, as an adjunct grain.
Are you going to let me finish?
Some Uncle
Ben's. Are you going to let me finish? That's it, folks. Hopefully you learned a little bit from this video, as always, and we will see you next time. Peter's going to talk now.
So we'll see you next time, guys. Comments and let us know about things.
Bam, let us know about your adjunct grains that you've been using at home. God, I can't talk. Oh.
Like the video. Subscribe. What else should we say, Ryan?
Bink.
Tell them hashtag Genius Rate My Beer.
Hashtag Genius Rate My Beer.
Hashtag Genius Rate My Beer.